My son changed the locks while I was at church and left all my things stuffed into plastic bags, thrown on the sidewalk like garbage. "Mom, this house is mine now. You have lived here way too long," he told me without even looking me in the eyes. "My name is Florence. I am 74 years old. I am a widow, and I single-handedly raised the man who just kicked me out of my own home today." But he had no idea about the paper I have been carrying in my purse for over 30 years. That day had started out so differently. It was full of that foolish hope that you still allow yourself at this age. I woke up early, as always, with an aching body but a light spirit. I brewed coffee in the usual pot, sliced some bread, and tied on a clean apron to fry some eggs with a little bacon I had saved for him. Charlie was still sleeping in his room. It was the same room I fixed up for him when he arrived 12 years ago, claiming it would only be for a few months. I believed him. I always believed him. As the smell of breakfast filled the kitchen, I thought that maybe that afternoon I could sit down with him. I wanted to tell him I had saved a little bit from my pension to fix the roof, which leaked whenever it rained hard. I dreamed that he would look at me and for once say, "Thank you, Mom," or hug me like he used to when he was a little boy. I left the house with a happy heart. The neighborhood was waking up slowly. You could hear the delivery truck honking its horn. The smell of freshly baked bread came from Mrs. Davis's house. The sun was not burning yet. It was just warming my back like a gentle touch. I put on my blue dress, the one I saved for Sunday service, and the shawl my mother knitted before she passed away. I walked the 6 blocks to the church, feeling almost weightless. Inside, the candles smelled of wax and incense. The wooden pews creaked as people kneeled down. The pastor spoke about family and forgiveness. I closed my eyes and said thank you. Thank you for still having a home. Thank you for having my son nearby, even if he was a deadbeat. Thank you because despite everything, I was still alive and could cook for someone. After the service, I stayed a while chatting with the ladies from the prayer group. I told them I was planning to make a pot roast that night, the savory kind, just the way Charlie liked it. They smiled, and one of them gave me some fresh herbs from her garden for the gravy. I bought the meat, potatoes, and carrots at the corner grocery store. I checked every single cent like I always did, because my pension does not allow for luxuries. But that day, I did not care. I was loaded down with heavy bags, sweating under the midday sun, but I was smiling. I imagined Charlie's face when he smelled the food from his bedroom. I figured that after dinner, I would tell him that I was proud of him, despite everything. A mother never stops believing in her child. For a moment, I felt like things could really get better. I thought those 12 years of him living rent-free in my house had not been in vain. Maybe he just needed one more push. I walked back slowly, enjoying the weight of the grocery bags because it meant I was going to take care of someone. The neighborhood smelled of cooking, of wet soil from someone watering their lawn, and of stray dogs. I passed by the convenience store on the corner and waved at Martha, the young woman who worked the register. She waved back with that tired smile she always wears. Everything seemed so normal. It all felt like home. I had bought that house all by myself after my husband died. He was crushed by a semi-truck on the highway 22 years ago. I had worked as a seamstress since my 20s. I spent 35 years sitting in front of a used Singer sewing machine I had bought. I sewed wedding dresses until my fingers swelled up. I made school uniforms at night and patched up curtains for the neighbors. Every stitch paid for a piece of that house. Every sleepless night, every holiday I missed because I had to deliver an order on time. Every time I burned my fingers with the hot iron. All of that was built into those walls. Then I turned the corner and saw the black trash bags piled up in front of my door. At first, I did not understand. I thought maybe the garbage truck had mixed up the houses, but then I saw the new lock. It was shiny and silver, and it was not mine. And I saw Charlie standing there, holding a set of keys with a look on his face I did not recognize. There was no affection, there was no hesitation, just pure coldness. "Mom, this house is mine now. You have lived here way too long." He turned around. He walked inside and slammed the door shut. The heavy thud echoed down the entire street. I stood there like a statue. The grocery bags slipped from my hands and the potatoes rolled across the sidewalk. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just walked over to the concrete curb in front of the house, and I sat down. The sun was beating down hard. The concrete burned right through the fabric of my dress. But I felt nothing. My hands were shaking a little when I rested them on my knees. Among the black trash bags he had thrown out, I saw something that hurt me even more than his words. My old sewing machine was lying on its side, its metal arm broken. The singer that had been with me throughout my entire adult life. The one I used to buy this house, brick by brick. He had dragged it outside and dropped it like it was a piece of junk. The pedal I used to pump with my foot for hours on end was cracked. One of the bobbins rolled away on the sidewalk. That machine was not just metal. It was my early mornings. It was my bleeding fingers. It was the prom dresses I sewed just to pay the water and electric bills. It was the smell of machine oil and burnt fabric that lingered on my skin. And he threw it out like trash without a second thought. I sat there for a long time. The sun began to shift, and the shadow from the street lamp slowly covered me. I did not cry. My eyes were dry, as if someone had stolen my tears, too. I just stared at the closed door and thought about all the times I opened that same door to let him in when he came home drunk at 3 a.m. I thought about the times I washed his laundry, cooked for him even when he was not hungry, and paid off his credit card debts, because he was my son. 12 years. 12 years of eating out of my fridge, sleeping in my spare bed, using my bathroom, without ever bringing a single dollar into the house. And now he was telling me I had lived here too long. The pain did not hit me all at once. It seeped in slowly, like a water leak. First, it was a lump in my throat, then a heavy weight on my chest that made my breaths short and shallow. I remembered when I bought the house. I was in my early 40s, a recent widow with a rebellious teenager who could not understand why his father was gone. I went to the title company with my husband's life insurance papers and the savings I had scraped together, stitch by stitch. I signed everything in my name only. The escrow agent asked if I wanted to put the boy's name on the deed too. I told him no. I knew Charlie was lazy since he was a little boy. I knew that if I put his name on it, he might try something like this one day. I kept the original deed in a plastic sleeve inside my large purse, the one I take everywhere. I never showed it to him. I thought it was not necessary. How foolish I was. Now that deed was the only shred of dignity I had left. The neighbors walked by and pretended not to see me. A woman I know from church looked down at the ground and walked faster. I felt so small, I felt so useless. Here I was at 74 years old, sitting on a curb with my belongings packed in trash bags like a homeless person. The smell of the black plastic baking in the heat made me nauseous. Poking out of one of them, I saw my wedding photo frame. The glass was shattered. The picture was crumpled. My husband in his rented suit and me in the dress I had sewn myself. Charlie had thrown that away too. He tossed it out carelessly, as if our history meant nothing. The pain grew deeper when I started remembering silly little details, like the time Charlie had the mumps when he was 7, and I stayed awake for 3 nights straight, putting cold cloths on his forehead. The time I bought his first middle school uniform with the money I earned from sewing 10 bridesmaid dresses in a single week. Or the time he showed up on my porch at 26 years old with a suitcase. After his wife kicked him out for being a deadbeat, I just looked at him and said, "Stay as long as you need to, honey." 12 years later, he was still here, and now he was tossing me out. My knees hurt. My back hurt. But what hurt the most was realizing that I was never a mother to him. I was just a free landlord. I was a cook. I was a maid. I was an old woman who was no longer useful. Right then, I saw Martha walking over from the convenience store. Martha is about 36 years old. She always wears an apron dusted with flour, and she has the face of someone who works twice as hard as they should. She sings in the church choir on Sundays, and she always saves me a seat in the pew. She saw me sitting there, surrounded by garbage bags, and stopped dead in her tracks. "Miss Florence, what are you doing out here? Why is all your stuff on the street?" I told her everything in a quiet voice, still holding back my tears. I told her about the locks, about Charlie's words, and about the broken sewing machine. She covered her mouth with her hands, then without saying a word, she sat down right next to me on the curb. She held my hand. Her hand was warm. It was rough from so much washing and cooking, but it was the first hand that had touched me with any kind of affection in a very long time. She went inside her place and brought me a glass of ice water with a slice of lemon. She draped an old sweater over my shoulders because the sun was going down and a chill was settling in. "Stay at my house tonight, ma'am. I am not going to leave you out here like a stray dog. My husband will not mind at all. There is plenty of room in the living room." Her simple gesture broke my heart even more than my son's cruel words. Martha, who barely knew me beyond a quick hello at church or buying milk at the store, was treating me with more respect than the person who came from my own womb. That hurts in a way you just cannot explain. She helped me push the bags up against the wall so they would not block the sidewalk. She picked up the broken sewing machine carefully, as if she knew exactly what it meant to me. She set it gently to the side. She did not treat it like trash. That small act of respect made me feel seen for the first time all day. We sat there in silence for a while. I stared at the closed front door of my house, and she would give my hand a gentle squeeze every now and then. I told her pieces of my life story. I told her about the nights I spent sewing until my vision blurred. I told her how I hid every dollar bill in a tin can under my bed. I explained how I turned down men who asked me out after I became a widow, just because I did not want anyone taking away my son's inheritance. What an irony. The very same son was now leaving me with absolutely nothing. The pain was still there. It was massive and heavy, but I was no longer completely alone. Martha listened to me without interrupting. She did not offer cheap advice. She was simply there. And at my age, that is worth more than anything else in the world. I realized I had been sitting on that curb for over 2 hours. My legs had fallen asleep. My back was burning with pain. But inside me, deep down, something started to shift. It was not quite anger yet. It was like a tiny ember that someone was softly blowing on. I touched my purse. The paper was still in there. It was folded up a few times and protected inside a plastic sleeve. The original property deed to the house. Charlie never asked to see it. He never took any interest in his old mother's paperwork. He just assumed that because he lived there and I was getting older, everything automatically belonged to him. He did not know that when I bought the house, I made absolutely sure it was only in my name. He did not know I had guarded that original document all these years, like a life insurance policy. I did not say anything to Martha. Not yet. I just hugged my purse tightly against my chest and took a deep breath. The smell of the pot roast I was never going to cook that night lingered in my nose. The broken sewing machine was still lying there. The crumpled photo from my wedding day was still there too. But I was not a trash bag. Not yet. I slowly stood up. Martha helped me carry 2 of the bags. I looked at the house one last time that day. The living room light was turned on. Charlie was inside, probably eating whatever leftovers I had left in the fridge, watching the television that I paid for. He never came out to see if his mother was okay. He did not care. I walked toward Martha's house, taking short, slow steps. My body was aching, but my mind was starting to work. That tiny ember was not going out. I knew this was not going to end with me sleeping in a stranger's living room while my belongings rotted on the street. I knew I had something he was completely unprepared for, and when the time came, Charlie was going to understand that his mother had not lived too long. She had only lived just long enough to see exactly who he truly was. We reached Martha's front door and she opened it for me as if she had been keeping watch over the street all afternoon. She did not bombard me with questions. She simply grabbed one of the heaviest bags and carried it inside. Her living room was small. It had a worn fabric sofa that smelled like clean laundry and a box fan on the floor that made more noise than actual breeze. I sat down slowly. My body felt twice as heavy after spending so many hours on that hard curb. Martha disappeared for a minute and came back with a cup of peppermint tea that tasted like simple comfort. I did not say much. My mind was working in silence. It was just like when I used to sew late at night, having to calculate every single stitch so the fabric would not warp. I looked out the front window facing the street, and out of the corner of my eye, I could see the lights on in my house. Charlie was in there, walking around as if nothing had happened. I imagined him opening my fridge, taking out a cold beer that I bought with my pension money, and throwing himself onto the couch I had paid for by sewing uniforms until my shoulders throbbed. And meanwhile, here I was with all my worldly possessions stuffed into plastic trash bags like I was some random stray. But I did not complain, not in front of Martha. I just sipped the hot tea and let the burning ember inside me continue to grow, nice and slow. That night, we had a simple dinner she warmed up, just some beans, a little cheese, and some leftover bread from the day before. Martha did not pressure me to talk. She made small talk. She talked about the church choir and how the pastor had asked about me during the evening service. I answered with one-word responses, but on the inside, I was putting the puzzle pieces together. I remembered every single detail from the day I bought the house. I remembered the old title agent with his thick glasses. I remembered the smell of damp paper in his office. I remembered the firm way I signed my name, and only my name, because even back then, I knew Charlie could not be trusted. I never showed him that piece of paper. He never asked about it. To him, I was just the old lady who cooked and washed his clothes. Now, that same old lady was holding on to the one document that could flip everything upside down. After dinner, Martha set up a mattress for me in the living room. She gave me a clean sheet that smelled like laundry dried in the sun, and a pillow that still held the shape of someone else's head. I lay down, but I did not sleep. The ceiling had a water stain in one corner, and I stared at it as if my entire future was written right there. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my Singer sewing machine dumped on the sidewalk, its metal arm bent, its foot pedal cracked in half. That machine had been my business partner for 35 years. With it, I paid for every single brick, every window, every drop of paint on that house, and he dragged it out to the curb like a filthy rag. That image would not leave my mind, but instead of crying, I started to map out my steps. First, I would observe. Then, I would verify my position. And finally, I would strike exactly where he least expected it. The next morning, I woke up before Martha. My body ached, but my mind was as clear as fresh well water. I went out to the tiny backyard where she had some potted basil plants and sat down on a plastic lawn chair. You could not see my house from back there, but you could hear it. I could hear the loud music Charlie was blasting. It was one of those country rock songs he loved, the kind that always just sounded like pure noise to me. Martha came outside holding a cup of hot coffee and stood quietly by my side. She combed my hair with her rough hands. She did it so gently, as if I were her own mother, and not just some old woman who showed up on her doorstep carrying nothing but trouble. That simple gesture gave me more strength than any motivational speech ever could. Martha. I almost called her by another name because sometimes my mind mixes up the names of all the people who have watched me hit rock bottom over the years. She whispered that if I needed anything, all I had to do was ask. I did not tell her the whole plan. I just told her that I had a very important piece of paper and that I needed to go downtown without anyone seeing me. I decided it was time to activate what I had been holding on to. It was an escape route I had paved in secret. It was not blind rage I was feeling. It was pure strategy. It was the exact same mindset I used when I had to finish a massive sewing order on a tight deadline. And I knew that if my timing was even a little bit off, everything would fall apart. That house was mine. It was mine alone. The deed I carried in my purse stated it clearly, in old but bold print. Charlie had lived there for 12 years for free. He ate, he slept, and he made a mess. but he had never contributed a single dime. And most importantly, he never once asked to look at the paperwork. He assumed that simply by being my son, he was already the rightful owner. What a massive mistake. I drank my coffee slowly while Martha swept the back patio. I asked her to bring me the broken sewing machine we had rescued from the curb. She placed it on the plastic outdoor table and left me alone for a little while. That was my moment. That was my ritual. I took a clean rag she had given me, dabbed it with a few drops of cooking oil from the kitchen, and began wiping down the metal, even though it was bent. I cleaned every corner. I wiped away every speck of dirt Charlie had left on it when he dragged it across the concrete. Then I used my bare hands to straighten the metal arm as best as I could, feeling the cold steel against my swollen joints. I was not going to fix it completely, not that day, but I was touching it as its rightful owner once again. It was no longer the junk machine he threw away. It was the tool I used to build everything I had. I hand-sewed a button back onto my blue dress that had fallen off, using a spare needle I always kept in my purse. Every single stitch was a firm decision. I was never going to sew for him again. I was done patching up his miserable life. I was patching up my own. When I finished, I wrapped the machine in a clean sheet and set it aside, the same way someone carefully tucks away a loaded gun. I was no longer the helpless victim sleeping in a stranger's living room. I was the seamstress who had paid off that house with her blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. Martha watched me do this from a distance, and at first she said nothing. She just brought me a glass of water and sat down across from me. She told me she had walked past the convenience store earlier that morning, and Charlie was out front talking to two of the neighbors. He was telling them that I was becoming too difficult to handle. He claimed I was getting too old to live on my own, and that he had heroically decided to take over the property for my own good. He said it while laughing, as if the whole thing were a funny joke. "The old lady has lived here way too long," he repeated, according to Martha. She heard him loud and clear. I just smiled on the inside. Let him talk. Let him laugh. The more confident he felt, the harder he was going to hit the ground. Martha squeezed my shoulder. She told me she would go with me wherever I needed to go. She swore she was not going to leave me alone in this fight. Her tired but steady voice reminded me that there are good people out there who will offer you a hand without asking for anything in return, not like your own flesh and blood, who sometimes only knows how to take and take. I spent the rest of the morning watching everything from the living room window. I watched Charlie drag more trash out of my house. He was tossing out my old keepsakes that I stored in the back room. He dumped them on the street like they were stacks of old newspapers. He did not even look back twice. Martha went out to buy some groceries, and when she returned, she told me he had already swapped out the living room curtains for dark, ugly ones that I always hated. He was decorating the house to his own liking, acting as if he actually owned the place. He invited a buddy over for lunch. You could hear them laughing all the way from the street. The smell of grilled burgers drifted over to us, and it made my stomach churn. Not out of hunger, but out of pure disgust. For 12 straight years, he watched me slave over a hot stove for him, and now he was using my kitchen as if I had never even existed. But I was already setting my plan in motion. I asked Martha to lend me a decent tote bag, not one of those flimsy plastic grocery sacks. I slipped the deed into a sturdy file folder she had saved from when her husband used to work at the city planner's office. The two of us stepped outside, walking slowly, trying to look as if we were just heading to the market. Nobody stopped us. We made it to the downtown district, and I tracked down the office of a lawyer I had known for years. His name was Mr. Robert. I used to tailor suits for him and his wife back when my eyesight was still sharp. I did not unload the whole story on him at once. I simply told him I needed to verify some property records and that my son had changed the locks on my front door without my permission. I handed him the deed. He read over the paperwork with his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He raised his eyebrows and looked at me over the rims. "Miss Florence, This is crystal clear. The house is solely in your name. A transfer of ownership was never executed. That boy does not have a single legal right to the property." I did not say another word. I did not mention that I also had all the old utility bills stashed away in a cardboard box that Martha had helped me salvage. I did not tell him that I had been hoarding every single receipt and document like someone stockpiling ammunition. I just asked him to draw up whatever legal paperwork was required to take back what was rightfully mine. He took down the details. He only charged me a modest fee because we went way back, and he promised that the initial cease and desist orders would be drafted within 2 days. I walked out of his office gripping a manila envelope. My heart was pounding hard, but my spirit felt calm. Martha was waiting for me outside, sitting on a bench under a large oak tree. She hooked her arm through mine, and we began the walk back home in quiet solidarity. The sun was dipping low, and the neighborhood was starting to smell like supper time. When we got back to her place, I tucked the envelope safely under my mattress, keeping it flat and hidden. Charlie was still at my house. He was feeling bold, blasting his loud music once again. I could hear him singing off-key from down the block. He had absolutely no idea that his mother, the very woman he tossed out onto the curb, had just taken the first major step to evict him. He did not realize that the old seamstress he deemed useless still had plenty of needle and thread left to weave her own form of justice. I took a seat at Martha's small kitchen table. I tore off a piece of bread and chewed it slowly. The tiny ember inside my chest was no longer just a spark. It was a controlled, burning fire. I knew exactly what my next move was going to be, and when I made it, neither that shiny new lock nor his sweet talking apologies were going to save my son. Martha ladled a bowl of hot soup and sat down directly across from me. She gave me a look that silently asked if everything was going according to plan. I just gave her a firm nod. I did not need to spell out every detail. She had already seen enough. I remembered how she combed my hair with such care. I remembered how she scooped up my broken sewing machine without treating it like garbage. I remembered how she opened her home to me without demanding a single thing in return. All of that was more grace than my own flesh and blood had shown me in 12 long years. I finished my bowl of soup and laid down to rest for a bit. Looking out from the living room, I could still see the lights blazing over at my house. Tomorrow was going to be a brand new day. Tomorrow I would continue moving my chess pieces across the board without anyone noticing a thing. Because this was no longer about getting into a shouting match. This was about making sure that by the time Charlie finally realized what hit him, it would be far too late for him to do anything about it. I stared at the edge of the envelope peeking out from under the mattress. The first move had been played. It was completely irreversible. The property deed he never once bothered to ask about was now in full motion. And me, Florence, the widow who sewed her entire life just to put a roof over her head, was no longer sitting on a concrete curb hoping for someone to take pity on her. I was standing tall once again, even if it was inside someone else's living room, even if my bones ached, even if I still carried the faint smell of those black trash bags he threw away. The entire game had shifted, and Charlie still foolishly believed he was winning. Poor boy. He had no idea that his mother had lived precisely long enough to watch him lose everything. I woke up before dawn. Martha's house still smelled like last night's soup, and the box fan was still humming with that rattling noise that seemed to match the rhythm of my thoughts. I did not make a sound. I slipped on the same blue dress from Sunday service. It was quite wrinkled now from wearing it so much, but I did not care. I double-checked to make sure the envelope with the initial legal drafts was secured safely inside my purse. Martha was sound asleep in her bedroom, her door left slightly cracked open. I caught a glimpse of her resting with her hair spread across the pillow. I thought about how this woman, who barely even knew me, had provided me with more comfort in just 2 days than my own son had in 12 years. I stepped out into the backyard. My Singer sewing machine was still sitting out there, wrapped tightly in a bed sheet like a closely guarded secret. I reached out and touched it for a moment, feeling the cold metal beneath the fabric. It gave me the exact surge of momentum I needed. I was not going to sit around and do nothing. Every step I took from here on out had to be completely silent. It had to be precise, just like sewing an invisible hem. The kind of stitch nobody notices until the garment drapes perfectly. I walked alone toward Mr. Roberts' downtown office. The city center was just beginning to wake up. Delivery trucks rolled slowly down the avenues, and the sweet aroma of freshly baked goods drifted out from the local bakeries. I arrived right as he was unlocking the heavy metal front door. He peered at me over the rims of his glasses and gave a half smile. It was the look of a man recognizing an old client who was no longer coming in for tailored suits, but for cold, hard justice. "Miss Florence, please come in. I have everything you requested ready to go." I sat down in the exact same wooden chair I'd occupied 2 days prior. Sitting squarely on his desk was a thick yellow folder covered in fresh legal stamps. Mr. Robert broke it down for me using very few words, exactly the way I prefer. The original deed was as clear as spring water. The house had never, at any point, been transferred into Charlie's name, not even once. Everything remained strictly in my name from the very day I signed the paperwork using my late husband's life insurance payout and my hard-earned sewing money. He handed me an official legal notice that needed to be served by hand. He also provided a certified document from the county records office explicitly stating that any attempt to change the locks on the property without my notarized signature was a severe criminal offense. I read through the pages slowly, tracing my finger beneath every single line of text. I felt as though every stitch I had sewn on that old singer over the last 35 years was now permanently etched onto those pages in thick black ink and official red stamps. I still did not reveal my entire hand to him. I simply requested that he also draft a certified copy for the local police department, just in case things escalated. He nodded in agreement and promised that everything would be finalized and ready to go within the hour. While I waited, I sat on a bench outside under the shade of a large oak tree that was dropping its autumn leaves onto the pavement. I pulled the original property deed out of my purse, the very one Charlie never bothered to ask about, and unfolded it with the utmost care. The edges of the paper had turned yellow over the decades, but the signatures remained bold and undeniable. My name, only my name. I recalled the title agent from 30 years ago asking me, "Ma'am, are you absolutely certain you do not want to list the boy as a co-owner?" I remembered responding with the exhausted tone of a woman who had already seen far too much of the real world. "No, sir, I sewed this house together all by myself." When Mr. Robert handed me the finalized packet of documents, I secured everything deep inside my purse and began the long walk back to Martha's house. She was already awake, sweeping the sidewalk out front with a plastic broom that looked older than the two of us combined. She spotted me walking up and immediately leaned the broom against the siding. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" "Everything is officially in motion," is all I told her. I did not need to break down the specifics. Martha was the kind of woman who understood everything just by reading your eyes. She brewed me a strong cup of black coffee and began brushing my hair once again, moving slowly, gently, working out the knots I had developed from sleeping on her cramped sofa. There was that simple gesture again. Her hands, rough from stocking shelves and hauling boxes at the corner store, were a constant reminder that I was no longer fighting this battle alone. While she ran the brush through my hair, I asked her if she would be my official witness to everything that was about to unfold. I told her that if anyone ever came asking questions, she just needed to tell the absolute truth. I needed her to confirm that I was completely lucid. She needed to testify that nobody was manipulating me. She had to swear that I slept in her living room on my own free will, only after my own son kicked me to the curb like a stray dog. She nodded her head without a second of hesitation. That was my armor. Long before Charlie could start spreading rumors around town that I was going senile, that the crazy old lady was losing her mind, or that Martha was planting crazy ideas in my head, I already had my defenses up. I held 2 legally binding letters drafted by Mr. Robert, along with a certified copy of my medical records from the local clinic. My primary care physician, who had been treating me for 20 straight years, had typed a very simple sentence on official hospital letterhead. It read, "Miss Florence retains full mental and physical capacity to make her own independent decisions." I secured that medical clearance that very same afternoon, completely under the radar. I simply scheduled a routine wellness checkup. Nobody suspected a thing. Meanwhile, Charlie was still holed up in my house, blasting his obnoxious music and telling anyone who would listen that I had willingly moved out for my own good. Martha told me she overheard him bragging at the convenience store. He was telling people that he was planning to put the house on the market soon because the old lady did not need all that space anymore. I smiled deep inside. Let him keep talking. Every single word that fell out of his mouth was just another piece of rope he was using to tie his own noose. The first real consequences hit much faster than I originally anticipated. The very next day, Mr. Robert dispatched a uniformed process server straight to the front door of my house. I did not go myself. I did not want Charlie to lay eyes on me just yet. The delivery man handed him the legal notice directly. It clearly stated that he had exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises, or he would face an immediate forced eviction by law enforcement. Charlie scribbled his signature on the delivery receipt without even bothering to read the paperwork properly. That is what Martha told me, anyway. She was watching the whole exchange from the front window of the store. At first, he just laughed it off. I heard him all the way from Martha's living room. It was a loud, booming laugh. The kind of laugh a man makes when he truly believes he is completely untouchable. But that very same night, the tide finally began to turn. The electric company issued an urgent notice. That is because I had discreetly taken a cab down to their main office with my property deed in hand. I made sure every single account was explicitly registered under my name, and I had them send a carbon copy of the updated terms directly to Mr. Robert. I did not shut the power off entirely. I simply established a hard legal boundary stating that any unpaid utility bills moving forward would be the sole criminal responsibility of the illegal squatter currently occupying the residence. Charlie had no idea that the decades' worth of old billing statements I kept hoarded in a shoebox proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that for 12 consecutive years he had never paid for a single kilowatt of electricity. I watched him from Martha's window as the sun began to set. He dragged a lawn chair out onto the sidewalk, cracked open a cold beer, and stared out at the street as if he did not have a care in the world. But the look on his face had completely changed. His brow was heavily furrowed with worry. When he finally turned his music back on, the volume was noticeably lower. Martha brought me a plate of fried eggs and rice, and the two of us sat at the table eating in total silence. I gave her the pieced-together updates. I confirmed that the legal eviction notice had been successfully served. I reassured her that the house still rightfully belonged to me, and that very soon I was going to walk right back through that front door he thought he had locked me out of. She just squeezed my hand tightly. On the third day, the very second that the 72-hour deadline expired, I organized my final move with the ruthless precision of a master seamstress. I placed a call to Mr. Robert. I also phoned a local municipal police officer I knew from years ago, back when I used to tailor his wife's uniforms. Then, I asked Martha to invite 3 specific women from our Sunday church service. I wanted Mrs. Davis, the lady who baked fresh bread, and the 2 sisters who ran the produce stand down at the farmer's market. I needed witnesses. I did not want a screaming match. I did not want a public scandal. I just wanted them to see it all with their own eyes. I wanted the entire neighborhood to know that the old seamstress who sewed until her fingers bled was not dead and buried quite yet. We arrived exactly at 11 in the morning. It was right when the sun was beating down the hardest, and the streets were packed with people running their daily errands. I carried the original house key I had never surrendered. The very same key he wrongly assumed was useless just because he had tampered with the lock. I also clutched the heavy envelope stuffed with all the legal documents. Mr. Robert walked confidently by my side, gripping his leather briefcase. The police backup, a young guy named Officer George, walked a few paces behind us without saying much. Martha and the 3 neighborhood witnesses brought up the rear, completing our group. When we finally came to a complete stop right in front of the front door, my heart was hammering inside my chest, but my hands were completely steady. I slid my original key directly into the shiny new lock. It turned perfectly. He had been too cheap and lazy to replace the entire deadbolt cylinder. He'd only swapped out the front faceplate. A lazy man's mistake. I pushed the front door wide open. The familiar smell of my own home hit me instantly. It was that exact same mixture of burnt coffee and dirty laundry that I knew all too well. Charlie wandered out from the hallway wearing flip-flops and a stained t-shirt. He was eating a sandwich that he had undoubtedly thrown together using whatever scraps were left in my refrigerator. When he saw me standing firmly in the doorway, backed by a small army of people, the food slipped right out of his hands and hit the floor. Condiments splattered all over his bare feet. "Mom, what the hell is this?" His voice was loud, but it completely lacked the icy coldness he had shown me out on the curb just days before. Now, he was terrified. Mr. Robert stepped forward and shoved a thick stack of copies directly into his chest. It included the property deed, the eviction notice, the county records document, and the certified medical evaluation explicitly proving I was perfectly sound of mind. "Mr. Charlie, this property belongs exclusively to Miss Florence. You are occupying these premises illegally. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather your personal belongings, or the officer here will proceed with a forceful physical eviction." Charlie stared down at the stack of papers in his hands. Then he looked up at me. His eyes were darting back and forth rapidly. It was the exact same panicked look he used to get when he was a little boy, and I caught him in a bald-faced lie. The women from the neighborhood were murmuring loudly behind me. Mrs. Davis made the sign of the cross. Martha stood faithfully by my side, completely silent but rock solid. She kept a firm hand on my arm, as if to remind me, "I am right here with you." "This is complete bullshit," he shouted, his voice cracking as he raised it. "You are completely crazy, old woman." "This Martha lady planted crazy ideas in your head. You promised me this house was going to be mine. Everyone in town knows I have been living here." That was the moment I dropped my very first revelation. I reached into my purse, pulled out the original deed I had been carrying around for 30 years, and shoved it directly in front of his face. "Read it, son. Take your time and read it carefully. It says the house is mine, mine alone. I never put a single brick in your name because ever since you were a little boy, I knew you were the kind to bite the hand that feeds you. 12 years rent-free, Charlie. 12 years eating, sleeping, and throwing my sewing machine out on the street like it was garbage. And you never, not once, asked to see this piece of paper." He went quiet for a second. The ladies from the neighborhood started talking louder. One of the sisters from the produce stand said it loud and clear. "Well, yeah, we all knew the poor woman was supporting him." Charlie turned beet red. He started yelling that he was going to call a lawyer, that this was not going to stand, that I was being manipulated. But Officer George already had the court order in his hand. He gave him 2 more minutes. Then came the second revelation, the one that completely finished him off. Mr. Robert opened his briefcase and pulled out another folder. It was the one I had quietly prepared over the last 2 days. It had every single saved receipt, copies of the credit card debts I had paid off for him, and a simple but legally binding letter. It proved that for 12 years, he had not contributed a single penny. Because of that, I could sue him for illegal occupation and property damage, including the broken Singer machine that Martha had photographed with her phone that very same day. It was not just the house, Charlie. I told him calmly, looking him directly in the eyes for the first time since he threw me out. It was everything I sewed just to have it. And you threw away my machine, the one that left my fingers swollen for 35 years. That machine was worth more than you in this house. Because at 74 years old, I simply had no more time to keep sewing for someone who was not worth it. Charlie tried to launch a counterattack right then and there. He suddenly started crying. They were fake tears that I had recognized since he was a little boy. He practically fell to his knees, grabbing my arm. "Mom, please, it was a mistake. I was just angry. The house is yours. Of course it is yours. Let me stay just a few more months while I figure out where to go. Do not do this to me in front of all these people." But Mr. Robert had already filed everything with the local judge that very morning. My armor was fully intact. There was no judge in the world who was going to believe a man who had thrown out his mother's belongings and smashed her sewing machine. I gave him exactly 10 minutes, not 1 minute more. I watched him shove his clothes into an old backpack, grab his cell phone, and take a few beers that were left in the fridge. Every time he passed by me to grab something, he lowered his gaze. The house started to smell different as he hauled his things out. It smelled like me again. Martha walked inside with me and helped pick up my wedding photo, which was still crumpled in the corner. She smoothed it out carefully and placed it on the table. The neighborhood ladies stayed by the door, witnesses to everything. When Charlie walked out for the last time, carrying 2 heavy bags, the exact same black trash bags he had used for my things, he stopped for a second right in front of me. "This is not over, Mom," he whispered so only I could hear, but I was no longer afraid. I answered him with the exact same calmness I used when sewing perfect hems. It was the crushing blow of a woman taking back what she had stitched together with her own life. Mr. Robert shook my hand and told me the rest of the legal process would be handled through the mail. He assured me Charlie would receive the formal lawsuit wherever he ended up. Officer George took some notes and left. The ladies from the neighborhood hugged me one by one. Martha stayed until the very end, helping me sweep up the shards of glass from the broken picture frame. I sat down in my armchair once again, the one I had paid for by sewing wedding dresses, and I stayed there until the early hours of the morning. The singer was still broken in the corner, but now it was inside, exactly where it belonged. I touched the bent metal arm and felt that the tiny ember that had sparked out on that curb was now a roaring fire. It was controlled, and it was entirely mine. Charlie was going to try something else. I knew it. He was going to look for cheap lawyers. He was going to talk trash about me all over town. He was going to try to get someone, anyone, to believe him. But I had already moved all my pieces into place. The property deed he never asked to see was only the beginning. What was coming next was much, much bigger. And he still had absolutely no idea. The house was completely silent. The only sound was the ticking of the kitchen clock I had bought myself at the flea market 15 years ago. Martha brought me a glass of ice water with lemon and sat across from me. We did not say much. We did not need to. Outside, the neighborhood went on with its life, but I knew the news was already spreading from house to house. Old Florence was back, and she had not come back asking for permission. She had come back with everything she had sewn together over an entire lifetime, and Charlie, wherever he ended up that night, was going to sleep without a roof over his head for the first time in 12 years. Meanwhile, I was sleeping under my own roof with my deed, my witnesses, and my broken sewing machine that was still mine. The game had not just changed. I was the one playing the game now, and he had just learned the absolute hard way that his mother had never lived too long. She had only lived just long enough to tie off the final stitch. I sat there in my armchair until dawn, the one I paid for stitch by stitch. The leather was worn out on the armrests, right where I used to rest my hands after spending countless hours at the Singer. Martha moved around the living room, picking up what was left of the broken photograph, smoothing the paper with the same gentle patience she used when she brushed my hair. The shattered glass crunched beneath her shoes, Every piece that dropped into the trash bag sounded like a harsh reminder of what Charlie had done without a second thought. The smell of stale coffee still drifted in from the kitchen, mixing with the scent of his sweat that lingered on the curtains. I took slow, deep breaths, feeling the ache deep inside my bones, but my mind was clearer than it had ever been. 3 days went by and I barely stepped outside. Martha came and went from the convenience store. She would bring me hot bread and some fresh cheese that smelled like a crisp Sunday morning. Together, we scrubbed the house from top to bottom. I swept the floor right where he had dropped his sandwich, and she washed the bed sheets that still reeked of his cheap cologne. Every time I walked past the broken sewing machine, I touched it. I ran my fingers over its bent metal arm like someone greeting an old friend. I did not cry. Not anymore. I just felt a cold, calculated anger. The kind you keep locked away safely because you know it will be incredibly useful later on. The neighbors started dropping by with silly excuses. Mrs. Davis brought over a plate of leftover chicken casserole, claiming she had made too much. The sisters from the produce stand left a bag of ripe peaches on the porch. They all asked questions with their eyes, but I just told them my house was finally back in order. I did not need to give any explanations. The whole town already knew. Charlie, meanwhile, did not completely disappear like I thought he would. Martha told me people had seen him sleeping on Peter's couch, that drinking buddy of his who always hung around him having beers. Peter had a small place 2 blocks over with a tin roof that turned into a baking oven in the afternoon heat. At first, Charlie tried to play it cool. He was going around saying that I was insane and that the crazy old lady could no longer tell the difference between what belonged to her and what belonged to everyone else. But after 5 days, Peter kicked him out. Martha found out because she saw him walk past the convenience store with a torn backpack slung over his shoulder. His face was all puffy, like someone who had not slept in days. He did not have a single dollar to his name. 12 years of living rent-free had completely stripped away his desire to even look for a job. Now he was wandering around begging for favors, and absolutely nobody wanted to deal with a 40-something-year-old man who only knew how to complain. On the 4th night, right after I locked the front door, I heard a soft knocking. It was around 11 at night. The neighborhood was dead quiet. The only sound was the dog down the street barking at the shadows. I stood up with a stiff back, threw a sweater over my blue dress, and walked toward the door. I looked through the peephole and saw his face. He looked thinner, with a messy 3-day beard and bloodshot eyes. I did not open it right away. I let him knock one more time. When I finally turned the deadbolt, using the original key I had never given him. I stared at him without saying a word. He broke eye contact first. "Mom, let me come inside. I just want to talk." I let him step inside, but I did not offer him a seat. He stood awkwardly in the middle of the living room, staring at the armchair, the spotless coffee table, and the Singer sewing machine that I had placed right back in its corner by the window. The smell of the house was entirely mine again, completely free of his cheap beer and dirty socks. Martha was in the kitchen washing dishes, but she stayed completely quiet, just listening. I crossed my arms and waited. He started speaking with a trembling voice, just like he used to do when he was a little boy begging me to buy him candy. "It was a huge mistake, Mom. I was just really angry that day. I had been drinking a little. I did not mean to. The machine just fell over on its own, I swear. This house is yours. Of course it is yours. Just let me stay in the little back room. I will not bother you. I can help you around the house, go run errands for you." Every single word out of his mouth sounded incredibly hollow, just like the empty promises he had made to me over the last 12 years. "Just a few months, Mom. Once I get a job, I will pay you back for everything. You are the best mom in the whole world." Those were the lies I had stitched together one by one in my own mind, foolishly hoping that someday they would magically turn into the truth. Now, hearing those words again, I felt that burning ember from the sidewalk sharpen into something much more dangerous. Martha walked out of the kitchen, drying her hands on her apron. She looked at him with absolutely zero pity. She gave him that same exhausted stare she uses for customers who try to skip out on their tab. Charlie noticed the paperwork spread out on the table. The yellow folder Mr. Robert had given me was sitting right there, wide open. He tried to force a smile. It was the exact same goofy grin he used whenever he wanted me to do his laundry. "Come on, let us just handle this like a family, okay? We do not need lawyers or cops involved. I am your son, your own flesh and blood. Remember when you took care of me when I had the mumps? You stayed up 3 whole nights without sleeping. You cannot just erase that." He was trying to use my own memories as bait, but I was no longer the broken woman sitting on the curb next to those trash bags. I answered him with a low, unwavering voice, the exact tone I used when haggling at the market, knowing my price was the right one. "Do you remember the machine, Charlie? The one you dragged out to the street and dropped like a dirty rag? That singer paid for this house. Every single stitch, every burned finger, every sleepless night. And you completely destroyed it. And now you expect me to let you sleep here like nothing ever happened?" He took a step closer. The tears started welling up, but I knew exactly what kind of crying this was. It was the exact same act he pulled when I caught him stealing $20 bills from my purse at 15 years old. He practically dropped to his knees, clutching the edge of the coffee table. "Please, Mom, I have nowhere else to go. Peter kicked me out because I could not help with the rent. I'm completely alone. Please just give me one more chance. I swear I will change." That was the exact moment I peeled back the first layer of the reality he failed to grasp. I grabbed the yellow folder and slid it right in front of him. It was not just the property deed. It was every single utility bill I had hoarded over the last 12 years. The electric, the water, the gas, the grocery receipts, even the crumpled store receipts for the beer he drank every night. Mr. Robert had a buddy of his who worked as an accountant add everything up. The final number was not small. It was over $30,000 in basic living expenses that I had covered out of my own pocket while he slept until noon and watched television. I shoved the paper into his hands and spoke without raising my voice. "And if we end up going to court, the judge is going to see the photographs Martha took that very same day. They will see the broken singer tossed on the concrete and the shattered picture frame of your dead father." Charlie turned pale white. He flipped through the pages with trembling fingers, looking as if he could not fathom that I, the pathetic old woman who sewed for a living, had actually kept every single receipt. He honestly believed that crying and begging for forgiveness would just magically make it all disappear. He stood up. He tried to hug me, but I took a step back. The stench of his sweat and sheer panic made my stomach churn. "I cannot possibly pay this back. I do not even have a steady job." He swallowed hard. "Mom, you would not actually do this to me. You are my mother." His voice completely cracked. Martha stood leaning against the kitchen door frame with her arms crossed. I looked him straight in the eyes. They were the very same eyes that had refused to look at me the day he changed my locks. "You really thought it was just about the property deed, did you not? You thought that by swapping out the deadbolt and tossing my stuff in the trash, you were suddenly the man of the house. But you were wrong. This is so much bigger than that, so much bigger." Then came the second major revelation, the one that hit him like a bucket of ice water. I reached into my purse and pulled out another sealed envelope Mr. Robert had prepared for me 2 days earlier. It was one I had kept completely hidden from everyone. It was not just the tallied expenses from the last 12 years. It was my official savings account statement. It held the money I had hoarded, stitch by painful stitch, ever since I became a widow. Every wedding dress, every school uniform, every set of living room curtains. I had opened a private account at the downtown bank 20 years ago, back when my eyesight was still perfect. The balance was not just a few $1,000s. It was well over $80,000. It was more than enough cash to buy this house all over again, with plenty left over to repair the Singer machine using original parts. I shoved the bank statement right in his face and gave him a dry, cold smile that did not reach my eyes. I could hire the absolute best lawyer in the entire state if you really want to drag this into a courtroom. With this money, I could completely remodel this house. With this money, I can help whoever I damn well please. Martha already knows that if anything ever happens to me, she gets half of everything. But you do not get a single red cent of this. You never did. The property deed you never bothered to ask about was only the beginning. The fortune I quietly sewed together over 35 years, that is what is really going to hurt you. Charlie stumbled backward. He had to collapse into the armchair, the very same armchair he claimed was his just days ago. His tears were completely different now. This was genuine, absolute panic. He started sweating profusely. Even though the house was cool, he just stared blankly at the numbers on the paper. He traced his finger over the bold digits, as if he could magically erase them. Martha brought him a glass of water, but he refused to take it. He started talking incredibly fast. He was spiraling into desperation. "This is completely unfair. I am your only son. People around town are going to say you abandoned me. I am going to go straight to the pastor at the church. I am going to tell everyone that Martha brainwashed you. I have a cousin who knows a cheap lawyer. We are going to fight this. You cannot just leave me out on the street with absolutely nothing." That was his final desperate maneuver. He called his cousin Stephen that very same night, using my landline because his cell phone was cut off. He begged him to come over. Cousin Stephen arrived about 30 minutes later. He was a skinny guy with a mustache whom I recognized from old family barbecues. He walked through the front door with the arrogant look of a man who thought he was going to lay down the law. But the moment he saw the heavy stack of legal papers spread across the coffee table, when he heard Charlie stammering about the massive debt and saw the thick folder stuffed with decades of receipts, he shut his mouth completely. He looked directly at me. Then he looked over at the broken Singer machine sitting in the corner. I politely asked him if he wanted a cup of coffee. He shook his head no. He just leaned in and whispered to Charlie, "When you are truly old and all alone, you are going to wish you had someone to take care of you." I walked right up to him. I did not lay a finger on him. I just stared him down with the exact same focus I used when sewing perfect hems, even when my joints were screaming in pain. "When you left me out on that concrete curb with my life stuffed into black trash bags, I was already all alone. But now, I am standing inside my own house, and you are going to sign a legal document that Mr. Robert drafted for me. You are going to completely waive any and all future claims to this property forever. You are going to pay me $100 every single month for the next 2 years to cover the damages, even if you have to sweep the city streets to earn it. And you are not going to step foot on this block without giving me a full week's notice in advance. If you follow those rules, I will drop the massive lawsuit. But if you do not, the bank, the local judge, and I are going to bleed you dry for every last penny of that $80,000 I have sitting in the bank." He just stared down at the floor for a very long time. The kitchen clock ticked away the seconds. Martha did not move an inch. Finally, he took the heavy pen I shoved into his hand, and he signed his name on the dotted line. His handwriting was crooked and sloppy, exactly like his life. When he finished, he stood up slowly, grabbed his torn backpack, and shuffled toward the front door. Right before stepping outside, he paused for a second. "I never thought you would actually go this far, Mom," I replied, without raising my voice in the slightest. This time, the blow landed perfectly clean. It was absolutely final. Martha walked over and wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders. She did not whisper any sweet, comforting cliches. She just squeezed me hard like someone who knew that words were completely unnecessary right now. I sat back down in my armchair and reached out to touch the Singer. The metal arm was still bent, but I had already called a mechanic from the flea market who specialized in fixing antique sewing machines. Within a week, it would be running like brand new. The house smelled incredibly different now. It smelled like me. It smelled like fresh pine floor cleaner and the lemon slices Martha had cut for our water. Outside, you could hear the sounds of the neighborhood settling in for the night. You could hear the faint hum of the delivery truck that would pass by in the morning, and the quiet murmurs of the local ladies who were already gossiping about the old seamstress who took back what rightfully belonged to her. My knees were throbbing, and my lower back ached, but for the first time in over a decade, my shoulders felt incredibly light. Charlie was finally going to have to learn how to survive without me. He was going to have to go out and look for a real job. He was going to have to sleep on lumpy borrowed couches and remember every single time he handed over that $100 payment that his mother had not lived too long. She had lived just long enough to quietly hoard everything on paper, just long enough so that when the day finally came, the needle would pierce exactly where it hurt the most. Martha stayed over that night too. We both slept out in the living room, her on the sofa and me kicked back in my recliner. Right before closing my eyes, I reached out and touched the thick envelope containing the original property deed still sitting inside my purse. That one piece of paper he never bothered to ask about finally had some company. The utility receipts, the massive bank statement, the legally binding settlement. It was no longer just a house. It was an entire lifetime sewn together with double reinforced thread, the exact kind of thread that absolutely refuses to snap, no matter how hard you pull on it. The next morning, I woke up bright and early. I brewed fresh coffee in the usual pot, sliced some thick bread, and fried up some eggs with crispy bacon. Only this time, it was strictly for me and Martha. The rich aroma filled the entire house, and looking out the front window, I noticed some of the neighborhood women walking by a little slower than usual, waving at me with a warm smile. The whole neighborhood was shifting, and I was shifting right along with it. And Charlie, wherever the hell he ended up spending the night, was finally starting to understand that mothers are neither immortal nor stupid. We are master seamstresses, and when we decide to sew our own justice, that final stitch holds forever. I still had to head downtown and meet with Mr. Robert to officially file the signed settlement. I still had to sit down and figure out exactly what I was going to do with a chunk of those massive savings, but all of that could wait for another day. For right now, it was more than enough just to sit peacefully at my own kitchen table. My sewing machine was waiting patiently to be repaired, and Martha was quietly humming a church choir hymn while she washed the breakfast dishes in the sink. The bright morning sun poured through the window glass, warming the exact spot on the table where 12 long years of deceit had abruptly ended with one crooked signature. I, Florence, a 74-year-old widow and a seamstress right to the bitter end, had officially tied off the most important stitch of my entire life. And the thread I used was not made of pity. It was made of solid steel. Exactly 4 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days passed since Charlie signed that legal document with his sloppy handwriting on my kitchen table. The neighborhood did not feel the same anymore. The morning still arrived with the exact same sunshine pouring through the living room window. But now, it actually felt warm. It was not just warming my skin, but it was warming something deep inside my chest that I honestly thought had burned out completely. That morning, I woke up before 6, just like I always do. I tied on a brand new, clean apron that Martha had bought for me, and I walked straight over to my Singer. It was not broken anymore. The mechanic from the flea market had it running like it just came out of the box. The metal arm was perfectly straight, the foot pedal pressed down smooth as butter, and there was a brilliant shine to the steel. It was almost as if the machine was trying to tell me that broken things can be put back together, as long as you treat them with a little bit of patience. I fired up the machine, and that familiar, comforting hum filled the entire house. I was not sewing for anyone else anymore. I was strictly sewing for myself. That day, I was putting the finishing touches on a brand new tablecloth for the kitchen. It was a bright cherry red with sunny yellow trim, exactly like the ones my own mother used to make back when I was just a little girl. The double reinforced thread fed through the needle clean and tight, without a single knot. Every time the needle punched through the fabric, it reminded me that I was no longer patching up someone else's miserable life. Martha was still sound asleep in the small back bedroom I had fixed up for her. After the dust settled from everything that happened, I asked her to move in permanently. Not as a hired maid and not as some charity case, but as genuine company. She still worked the register at the convenience store down the street in the mornings, but she started closing up shop a lot earlier. She would walk through the front door carrying a loaf of hot bread and all the latest neighborhood gossip, which always managed to pull a smile out of me. The house was far too big for one old woman to live in all by herself, and having her around turned the silence into something cozy and warm, rather than empty and hollow. I sat proudly in front of my machine with a steaming mug of black coffee resting right next to me. The rich smell of the bacon I had just fried up for the two of us drifted through the hallways. It was no longer a meal I was cooking while worrying about Charlie. It was my breakfast, and I could choose to share it with whoever I damn well pleased. I gently tapped the locked wooden drawer where I now kept the original property deed. I did not have to lug it around inside my heavy purse like some dirty little secret anymore. I did not need to hide it. Everyone in town already knew the true story. Mrs. Davis started dropping by every single Sunday after church service to drink iced tea on the porch. She told me that several of the older women in the congregation had started asking about me. They were not asking out of pity. They were asking out of sheer respect. One of them, Mrs. Higgins, lived 3 blocks over and had a son who was just as much of a lazy deadbeat as mine. She sent a message through the grapevine saying she desperately wanted to come sit down and talk. She said she heard the entire story from start to finish, and she needed some serious legal advice. I sent word back telling her to drop by whenever she wanted. I did not charge a dime. I just sat there, listened to their problems, and told them exactly what I thought. That was an entirely new chapter for me. I used to sew just to keep the lights turned on. Now, I sewed simply to keep my hands busy, and I spoke up so that other old women would not end up sitting on a concrete curb with their whole lives stuffed into black trash bags. This brand new reality became crystal clear that very afternoon when Martha walked through the door carrying a heavy bag of ripe peaches from the market. She stopped right in the entryway, watching me run the sewing machine, and she smiled with that exhausted expression I had grown to know so well. "Miss Florence, it honestly looks like you never even left," she said, dropping the heavy grocery bag onto the kitchen table. "The house smells exactly like you again. It smells like lavender soap and strong, dark roast coffee." I smiled right back at her, never once letting my foot off the metal pedal. The old singer purred away smoothly. It sounded just like an old stray cat that finally found a warm patch of sunlight to sleep in. I told her I had received an official letter from the downtown bank in the morning mail. That $80,000 was sitting right there, completely untouched, plus a solid chunk of interest that had slowly but steadily piled up over the years. I was not planning on blowing it on flashy luxuries. I was going to use a small slice of it to finally patch up that leaky roof that dripped whenever a heavy storm rolled through. The exact same leak I had been so eager to show Charlie on that fateful Sunday morning before he shattered my world. Another piece of the money, a slightly smaller cut. I had officially set aside in a trust for Martha. She tried to fight me on it at first. She swore up and down that it was not necessary, but I slammed the legal paperwork down right in front of her face and told her it was my money and my final decision. It was $8,000 in cold, hard cash. It was enough for her to finally remodel that run-down convenience store, install brand new shelving units, and maybe even hire a teenager to help work the register during the busy afternoon rushes. Her eyes instantly filled up with water, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were the kind of tears that only fall when another human being truly sees you for the very first time. "You do not owe me a single thing in this world, Miss Florence," she whispered softly as she stood behind my chair, brushing my hair just like she always did, using those rough, hard-working fingers that constantly smelled like baking flour and dish soap. "I owe you for that ice-cold glass of lemon water you handed me when I was sitting out on that hot concrete curb like a stray dog," I answered her, completely deadpan. "I owe you for reaching out and holding my hand when no one else would. You cannot put a price tag on something like that. It cannot be bought, but it can be shared." We just sat there, in comfortable silence for a long time. The bright red tablecloth was practically finished. I snipped the final thread, folded it up into a neat square, and handed it directly to her. She ran the fabric through her rough fingers as if it were spun from pure gold silk. That exact moment, just the two of us standing in the kitchen with the golden afternoon sun cutting sideways through the blinds and the motor of the Singer still radiating heat. That was my brand new reality. There were no black trash bags. There were no illegally swapped door locks. It was just two women who had finally learned the hard way that you can never expect your own blood to give you what you actually deserve. But sometimes, blood eventually comes crawling back. It was exactly 1 week after I finished that tablecloth when I heard a soft, hesitant knock at the front door. It was 7 o'clock in the evening. The neighborhood already smelled like roasted chicken and garlic, and the dog down the street was barking at the shifting shadows. Martha was in the kitchen stirring a massive pot of savory beef stew, the rich, hearty kind that I absolutely loved. And I was sitting at the table reviewing some old tax receipts that Mr. Robert had finally mailed back to me. I opened the door without an ounce of fear. Standing right there on my porch was Charlie. He was skinnier than he had ever been. He had that exact same torn backpack slung over his shoulder, but this time it was scrubbed clean. His messy beard was neatly trimmed down, and his clothes, while clearly worn out, were freshly laundered. He was no longer wearing the arrogant face of a man who thought the entire world owed him a favor. He was wearing the exhausted face of a man who had spent the last 4 months sleeping on lumpy borrowed couches and had finally realized that empty promises do not put food in your stomach. "Mom, I am just here to drop off my first payment," he said quietly. He could not even bring himself to look me in the eyes at first. He reached deep into his front pocket and pulled out a crumpled white envelope containing exactly $100, all in crisp $20 bills. He placed the money into my open palm as if he were laying an offering at an altar. I stepped aside and let him cross the threshold, but I did not let him walk all the way into the living room. We stayed standing right there in the narrow hallway. The harsh glare of the overhead bulb hit him directly in the face, and there were no comfortable couches nearby for him to sink into and hide. Martha poked her head out from the kitchen doorway, took one long look at who it was, and silently went right back to stirring her stew without saying a single word. "I knew I owed this to you. I have been working on a construction crew, out by the new highway overpass," Charlie continued. His voice was hoarse and raspy. "The pay is not great, but it is steady hours. I sweep the sites, I haul concrete blocks, I basically do whatever they tell me to do." He swallowed hard. "Cousin Stephen actually hooked me up with the foreman right after he kicked me out of his house, too. He told me that if I do not bust my ass and work, I do not get a roof over my head." I stared at him without interrupting a single word. 4 months, 2 weeks, and 3 long days out in the real world had completely stripped away every last ounce of his arrogance. He was no longer loudly proclaiming that the house belonged to him, or that I had lived there way too long. Now he was talking about grueling 12-hour shifts. He was talking about how his feet throbbed in agony because he was forced to wear heavy steel-toed work boots that were a full size too small. He told me he had actually shown up to church a couple of times on Sunday. He did not go to pray, really. He He just went to sit quietly in the very back pew where nobody would notice him. He said the pastor had walked up and asked him how I was doing. He said he had absolutely no idea what to say. "I want to apologize to you, Mom," he whispered. "Not like the last time. I am not saying this just so you will let me move back into my old bedroom. I just want to say, I am so sorry. I am sorry about smashing the sewing machine. I am sorry about shoving your whole life into garbage bags. I am so sorry for making you feel like you were nothing but a worthless burden inside your own home." He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "I know I signed that legal paperwork. I know I cannot ever claim a single thing in this house. But if you will let me, I want to keep bringing you this $100 every single month. And if you ever need help with heavy lifting around the property, like painting the front siding or climbing up to patch that leak in the roof, just call me. I am not asking to live here. I know I permanently lost that right." For the first time in his entire life, his words did not sound like a cheap theatrical performance. They sounded deeply exhausted. They sounded completely real. I stood there and thought about my Singer machine, which was currently running smoother than ever. I thought about my old wedding photograph, which Martha had carefully placed into a brand new frame behind thick, heavy glass. I thought about the 12 agonizing years he ate out of my refrigerator without bringing a single dollar through the front door. And I realized right then and there that true forgiveness was not a warm hug, and it was certainly not an open door. Forgiveness was a strict, unbending condition. "You are going to keep making those payments, Charlie," I told him, using that exact same firm tone I used when haggling down prices at the meat market. $100 every single month, exactly like you signed on the dotted line. And every 3 months, you are going to march up to this door and hand me a copy of your pay stub, just so I can see with my own 2 eyes that you are actually holding down a real job. You will not step foot into my living room, and you will never lay a finger on my Singer again. You treated that machine like absolute garbage, and now I am the only person who gets to respect it." I leaned in just a fraction of an inch. "If you manage to string together 6 solid months of payments without missing a single deadline, then maybe I will invite you to sit in the kitchen for a cup of coffee. But if you slip up even once, Mr. Robert has that massive lawsuit fully prepped and ready to file. I will let the county judge bleed you dry for every last cent I ever wasted on you. Do you understand me?" He nodded his head very slowly. For the first time in his entire adult life, he looked me dead in the eyes without instinctively looking away. There was something completely different hiding in his stare. He was no longer the helpless 7-year-old boy suffering from the mumps. He was no longer the pathetic 36-year-old deadbeat who showed up on my porch dragging a heavy suitcase. He was finally looking at me like a grown man who was just starting to understand that mothers do not live forever. "I understand perfectly, Mom. Thank you for not completely slamming the door in my face." I reached into the envelope, pulled out a single $20 bill, and handed it right back to him for his bus fare home. It was not charity. It was strictly an investment to make sure he made it to the construction site in one piece the next morning. I locked the heavy deadbolt as he walked down the driveway, and I kept my hand pressed flat against the solid wood for a moment. The heavy click of the lock did not echo with that devastating boom anymore. It just sounded like a clean, peaceful closing. It was not an ending. Charlie's humbling little visit was only one small piece of the puzzle. What truly changed everything was what happened out in the neighborhood shortly after. Exactly 2 weeks later, I hosted the very first afternoon sewing circle inside my home. I formally invited Mrs. Higgins, the 2 sisters who ran the produce stand, and 3 other older women from church who had heard the rumors. We arranged a circle of chairs right in the middle of the living room. I pulled out my Singer, along with 2 spare machines I had borrowed from a friend. I taught them how to properly patch up their own living room curtains. I showed them how to sew tight, reinforced hems that would never fray. But more importantly than all of that, I sat there and told them, without an ounce of dramatic flair, exactly how I had secretly guarded my property deed for 30 long years without anyone ever asking to see it. I explained how one faded, yellowed piece of paper ended up being worth far more than 12 years of free meals. I showed them exactly how a widowed seamstress can stay completely silent just long enough to slide the needle precisely into the spot where it hurts the most. Mrs. Higgins, who was 71 years old and had a grown son who showed up begging for cash every single Friday, was the first one to speak up. She admitted that it had never even crossed her mind to track down the official legal title to her own home. She'd simply assumed that because she was a mother, everything she owned automatically belonged to her children. That afternoon, she sewed her very first table runner while crying softly to herself. The rest of the women immediately crowded around her. They did not surround her with pity. They surrounded her with that fierce, unspoken solidarity that only sparks to life when an old woman finally decides to tell her brutal story without holding anything back. By the end of the afternoon, we had 6 beautifully finished table runners and 1 rock-solid promise. Every 2 weeks, we were going to gather right back in this living room. I promised to provide the heavy-duty thread and the hot coffee. They promised to bring their own sewing machines or simply their own 2 hands. The impact was not earth-shattering. It did not make the front page of the local newspaper. It was incredibly small and subtle, exactly like a row of tiny stitches, but it spread rapidly across town. Martha told me that when the older women came into the convenience store now, they were constantly asking each other for legal advice before blindly signing anything over to their kids. Some woman I did not even know had a massive bouquet of fresh flowers delivered to my porch from the local florist. There was a tiny card tucked inside that simply read, "You spoke up for all of us." It was not some fancy charity foundation. It was something far more real than that. It was absolute proof that my sewing had not just paid off my mortgage. It had actually started stitching something powerful into the lives of the women all around me. Later that night, I sat down deep inside my armchair. My beloved singer was safely tucked away under its protective canvas cover. Martha was humming a quiet tune out in the kitchen while scrubbing out the coffee mugs from our little meeting. The neighborhood outside was completely still. The only sound in the world was the steady ticking of that wall clock I had bought myself 15 years ago. I reached out and tapped the wooden drawer where I now kept my property deed, neatly filed next to the stack of utility receipts and that massive bank statement. It was no longer a loaded weapon. It was just a quiet reminder. $80,000 in cash cannot rewrite the painful mistakes of the past, but it absolutely gives you the sheer freedom to choose your own future. I chose not to be alone anymore. I chose to pass down everything I knew. I chose to offer a half-measured forgiveness to a son who was learning how to be a man far too late in life, but who was at least finally putting in the effort. I do not feel any bloated arrogance, and I have absolutely no desire to show off. I just feel the quiet, deeply rooted satisfaction of a woman who spent her entire life bent over a needle, fully knowing that every single stitch she ever made actually counted for something. I raised a son who callously threw me out onto the street. That is the ugly truth. But I also raised the inner strength to pull myself up off that concrete curb without shedding a single tear. I secretly hoarded legal documents that he never once bothered to ask about. And when the final moment arrived, those yellowed pieces of paper spoke for me with a voice that was infinitely louder than any scream. That broken singer turned into the very machine I now use to teach others how to survive. That burning concrete sidewalk transformed into the exact spot where I finally understood that mothers never live too long. We just live exactly long enough to tie off the final stitch with the kind of thread that never, ever breaks. And as for me, Florence, I am still right here. I am 74 years old. My hands are swollen and scarred from decades of sewing. I have a dear friend who gently brushes my hair, and I have a son who drops off $100 every single month, like a man paying off a massive debt with his own shattered pride. The house smells like rich beef stew and fresh lavender soap. My singer rests spotless in its favorite corner, and when the morning sun pours through the front window, it no longer just warms my tired back. It warms the memory of that property deed I pulled out of my purse while sitting on that curb without shedding a tear. It warms the absolute certainty that the old seamstress they tossed out like garbage had just begun sewing the most important stitch of her entire life. The kind of stitch that patches up more than just torn fabric. It patches up the exact place a woman truly deserves to hold in this world.